The old Victorian house stood on the outskirts of town, long forgotten and shrouded in weeds and shadows. Its once grand facade was now faded and peeling, but for Sarah, it was perfect. She was moving from the city, searching for a place to write her novel, and this house, with its ample space and low rent, felt like the ideal retreat. The realtor had warned her about the house's history, but Sarah brushed it aside, eager to escape the bustling city life. On the first day, she spent hours unpacking boxes and setting up her writing nook in the sunny living room. The basement door caught her eye, a heavy, wooden door that creaked ominously when she opened it. A dark staircase led down into the depths of the house. Despite its uninviting appearance, Sarah felt a strange pull to explore it. The basement was large and filled with old furniture covered in dust sheets, remnants of the house's past. She ran her fingers over the fabric, contemplating what stories these pieces could tell. But as she wandered deeper into the space, she noticed something odd, an unnatural chill that seemed to settle in the air. It was different from the usual coolness of a basement. It felt oppressive, almost alive. The further she went, the more she felt the weight of the darkness pressing in around her. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting in ways that made her uneasy. When she reached the far wall, she spotted a small door, partially hidden behind an old cabinet. It looked newer than everything else in the basement, and her curiosity was piqued. Sarah hesitated, her instincts warning her against opening it. But she couldn't resist the temptation. She pulled the door open, revealing a narrow corridor that led deeper into the house's foundation. The air was musty, and the faint smell of decay wafted through the passage. With her flashlight in hand, she stepped inside, her heart racing with both excitement and dread. The corridor was dimly lit and lined with more dust-covered furniture. It felt as though it had been untouched for years. As she moved further in, she began to hear a faint sound like soft sobbing or muffled cries. The noise sent shivers down her spine, and she almost turned back, but her curiosity compelled her to continue. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the sobbing grew louder. It was coming from a small, dark room at the end of the corridor. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was smaller than she expected, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room, a small wooden chair sat empty, and on the floor lay a tattered blanket. But what caught her attention was the wall opposite her. It was covered in scratch marks, deep and jagged, as if something had clawed at the surface in desperation. She felt a chill run through her as she examined the scratches. They seemed to form words, names, perhaps, or pleas for help. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that enveloped her. A sense of dread filled the air, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her. Just as she was about to turn and leave, she noticed a small notebook lying on the floor next to the chair. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age. With trembling hands, she picked it up and opened it. The entries were chaotic, filled with frantic scribbles and erratic handwriting. It appeared to be the journal of the previous tenant, someone who had clearly been driven to madness. "They watch me," one entry read. "Every night, I hear them whispering. They say I'm not alone down here." I can feel them breathing. Her heart raced as she read the words. The entries grew increasingly disturbing, detailing strange occurrences, unexplained noises, and the author's descent into paranoia. "They come at night," another entry warned. "Do not let them in. If you hear them knocking, do not answer." Sarah's pulse quickened as she scanned the pages. Each entry grew darker and more unsettling, culminating in a frantic final note: "I can't escape. They want me. They won't let me leave." The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, and she felt a chill creep down her spine. It was as if the basement itself was alive, pulsating with the remnants of the torment it had witnessed. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind her, causing her to jump. Heart racing, she spun around, but nothing was there. The silence was deafening, and the air felt thick with tension. She knew she needed to leave, but her legs felt like lead as she backed away from the dark room. As she turned to exit, she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck, and the whispering returned, low and insistent. It felt as if the shadows were reaching out, trying to pull her back into the darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, she dashed down the corridor, racing toward the staircase. But as she reached for the door, it slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic set in as she rattled the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let me out," she screamed, but the only response was the chilling echo of her voice bouncing off the walls. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, taunting her with unintelligible words. She felt their presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest. With no other choice, she turned and sprinted back through the corridor. The scratching sounds returned, clawing at the walls, as if something was trying to break free. Desperate, she reached for the small door she had come through, her hands trembling as she pulled it open and stumbled into the basement. The air was cold and heavy, and the shadows seemed to pulse with life. She could feel something behind her, lurking in the darkness, and she didn't dare look back. She sprinted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears, and burst through the basement door. But as she reached the top, it slammed shut behind her, locking her in the living room. Sarah leaned against the door, breathless and shaking. She glanced around the darkened room, searching for some sign of life, but the house was silent. Just as she thought she might be safe, the lights flickered, plunging her into darkness. The whispers returned, echoing in her mind, and she felt a cold draft wash over her. "Get out," a voice seemed to hiss, sending chills down her spine. It felt as if the house was alive, pulsating with anger and despair. She stumbled back, her heart racing, and found herself in the kitchen. Frantically, she looked for a way to escape. The front door was locked, the windows sealed shut. It was as if the house was determined to keep her inside. A feeling of dread settled over her as she moved through the rooms, searching for an exit. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with terror. It was then she noticed the basement door had creaked open slightly, as if inviting her back. Panic surged through her. She couldn't go back down there. But as she turned to flee, the shadows shifted, coiling around her like tendrils, pulling her toward the basement. She screamed, fighting against the darkness, but it was too strong. The whispers escalated into a cacophony of voices, and she could hear them clearly now, crying out for help, begging her to join them. With a surge of determination, she broke free from the shadows and dashed toward the back door, throwing it open and running into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she gasped, her lungs burning as she stumbled down the steps and into the yard. She didn't stop to look back, racing through the overgrown grass and toward the road. But as she reached the edge of the property, a deafening roar echoed from the house. The windows rattled, and the ground beneath her feet trembled, as if the very foundation was shaking. The whispers turned into screams, filled with rage and despair. She felt a force pulling her back, but she fought against it, desperate to escape. As she reached the road, she turned for one last glance at the house. It loomed behind her, dark and ominous, the windows now glowing with an otherworldly light. The whispers had turned to a chorus of screams, pleading, taunting, mocking her escape. As she stumbled away, her heart racing, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it had devoured the souls of its previous tenants, leaving only their cries echoing in the walls. She made it to the road and began to run, not stopping until she reached the safety of the nearest town. The following days were a blur of anxiety and terror. Sarah tried to put the experience behind her, but the whispers lingered in her mind, haunting her every moment. She struggled to write, the words eluding her like phantoms slipping through her fingers. The house had left a mark on her, and she could feel its presence everywhere. Desperate for answers, she began researching the history of the house. She discovered that it had a dark past. Multiple families had lived there, but none had stayed long. Rumors of strange occurrences, disappearances, and haunting whispers surrounded the property. Each family had left behind fragments of their stories, echoes of their terror that lingered long after they were gone. Sarah learned about a woman who had vanished without a trace while living in the house, leaving only her frantic journal behind. The more she read, the more she felt a connection to those who had come before her, a bond forged in fear and despair. They had all heard the whispers, all felt the weight of the darkness that lurked within the walls. As time passed, Sarah's life became a constant battle against the house's grip. She could hear the whispers in her dreams, calling her back, urging her to return. The sense of dread never left her, a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. Her writing dwindled to nothing, consumed by the darkness that had seeped into her very being. One stormy night, she found herself standing outside the house once more, drawn back by an unexplainable force. The wind howled around her as she approached the front door, heart pounding in her chest. The whispers enveloped her, a siren's call promising answers and release. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open, stepping back into the darkness that awaited her. Rachel and Eric had envisioned a peaceful escape. They rented a remote cabin in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, hoping to leave behind the stress of urban life. The promise of tranquility, fresh air, and no cell service was exactly what they both craved. The cabin had a rustic charm, sitting on a hill with an expansive view of the forest. Their first day was ideal hiking, cooking over an open fire, and laughing together as if it had been ages. But as the sun sank beneath the horizon, an unsettling quiet settled over the woods. No birds, no insects, only silence. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, pausing mid-sentence during their card game. "Hear what?" Eric replied, shuffling the deck. She paused. The sound had been faint, almost like her name being called, but muffled, as if heard through water. "Nothing," she murmured, dismissing it with a shrug. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. The cabin, surrounded by dense trees, felt too isolated. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her ears like a weight. Then, just as she was starting to drift off, she heard it again, a faint, warbled version of her name. "Eric," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Did you hear that?" Groggy and annoyed, Eric listened for a moment before dismissing it as wind. But Rachel was sure. It hadn't been the wind. It was something else. The next morning, Eric seemed distant, brushing off Rachel's concerns as paranoia. He went fishing at the nearby stream while she stayed behind, trying to shake off the unease. She spent the day reading and tidying, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By dusk, Eric still hadn't returned. Rachel ventured to the stream, calling his name, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back, distorted and hollow. "Eric," she yelled again, her voice trembling. "Eric," the echo replied, mimicking her tone but twisting it into something eerie and unfamiliar. Her heart raced as she spun around. The woods, once serene, now seemed alive. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the air buzzed with an unexplainable energy. She stumbled back to the cabin, locking every door and window. Night fell, and Eric still hadn't returned. Just as Rachel was about to call for help, a knock came at the door. Relief flooded her. "Eric," she called, running to the door. When she opened it, Eric stood there, but something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, his expression slack. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, though his lips barely moved. His voice was layered, as if two people were speaking at once. "What happened?" she stammered, stepping back. Before he could respond, his body jerked unnaturally, and he let out a guttural scream. Then, without warning, he bolted into the woods. Rachel stayed still. She slammed the door shut, retreating in a panic as her mind spun wildly. Outside, the forest erupted with sound, an eerie repetition of her name, distorted and echoing back to her from the darkness. By morning, Rachel had vanished. The locals discovered the cabin left in disarray, furniture overturned, and the walls marred with strange scratches, words in a language no one could understand. Some believe the forest claimed her, as it had claimed others in the past. If you stand at the edge of the woods at night, you might hear the faint echoes of her frantic cries. But beware, if you call back, the forest will learn your name. And once it knows your name, it will never let you go.